Hi guys, Mr. Davis again. We are in the last couple of sections of George versus George. This is on page 54. It's called Whatever Happened to King George. It's part of the Afterword. An Afterword is a section of a book that comes at the end. It's actually after the end of the book, but it has to do with what comes later. This can happen in fiction and non-fiction. We start Whatever Happened to King George with a quote from Samuel Shoemaker, an American loyalist who met King George in 1784. It says, I wished some of my violent countrymen could have had such an opportunity as I have. I think they would be convinced that George III has not one grain of tyranny, and that he cannot be that bloody-minded man they have so repeatedly called him. It is impossible. A man of his fine feelings, so good a husband, so kind a father, cannot be a tyrant. The last king of America was no villain, but to this very day some people believe he was an insane, dim-witted tyrant. Many Americans blame him personally for every British act of repression, but the truth is that King George was Great Britain's most cultured monarch and was filled with good intentions. Like all other kings and most Europeans at the time, he believed that God granted kings and nobility the divine right to rule. He considered it his religious and patriotic duty to uphold age-old British rights and liberties, and the duty of his subjects to respect the crown by obeying British law. King George sincerely wished to be a good father to all his people, including Americans. I do not pretend to any superior abilities, he once said, but will give place to no man in meaning to preserve freedom, happiness, and glory. That I have erred is undoubted. Otherwise I should not be human. But wherever I have failed, it has been from the head, not the heart. The king was sure his loss of America would make Britain second-rate power. It didn't. King George, Parliament, and the young United States all needed each other. John Adams traveled from America in 1785 to meet with King George and try to restore good relations. I will be very frank with you, the king told him. I was the last to consent to the separation, but I have always said that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. Before long, Great Britain was making more money trading with an independent America than it ever had made from dealing with the colonies. During King George's reign, the Industrial Revolution helped to make Britain the world's richest nation. Far-reaching British explorations took place in the Pacific Ocean near Antarctica and on the continent of Africa. The king practiced scientific farming, had a powerful telescope built, and collected scientific instruments. Music flourished. King George began a Royal Academy of the Arts. This generous monarch freely opened his excellent library to scholars, given an enormous amount of his money to charities and the needy, and improved education for the poor. Even so, his popularity swung up and down. At times, he was viciously mocked in cartoons, and there were several attempts to assassinate him. By 1809, though, almost everyone in England seemed to love him and admire his moral character. Following a Jubilee celebration, a British victory, and yet another war with France, the one newspaper reported that the whole nation was like one great family in thanksgiving for the father of the people. Perhaps as early as 1765, King George had begun to suffer brief bouts of madness caused by a rare hereditary disease known as porphyria. Between 1810 and the time of his death, he became blind, almost deaf, and increasingly more insane, stamping violently, allowing no one to cut his wild white beard, and holding long conversations with angels. Every so often, he seemed to be getting better. Though his doctors confined him in a straitjacket, in his old age he said that I am born a gentleman, shall never rest my head on my last pillow in peace, and quiet as long as I remember the loss of my American colonies. In 1811, when King George became too ill to rule, his son, the Prince of Wales, was sworn in as regent. The king finally died at age 82 in 1820. Over 30,000 black-clad mourners attended his funeral. One of these remarked, "Thus sunk into an honored grave, the best man and best king that ever adorned humanity, and who for 60 long years had been the father to his people." Last section is called, What Did George Do Next? Quote from Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States. He was in every sense of the words a wise, good, and great man. He was incapable of fear, meeting personal dangers with the calmest of concern. His integrity was almost pure, his justice inflexible, the whole of his character, in its mass, perfect. By the end of the Revolutionary War, George Washington was more than a war hero. He was the most beloved and admired person in America. In May 1787, he was unanimously chosen to be President of the Constitutional Convention, whose members were writing the Constitution of the United States. Under his fair, quiet leadership, it went into effect a year later. It has been called the greatest document of its kind ever written. The Continental Congress ran the new country for 6 years until February 1789, when George Washington was elected by the members of the Electoral College in each state to become the first President of the United States. Washington, now 57 years old, was worried about his ability to lead this experiment in governing the new nation. My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of execution, he said. He feared there would be an ocean of difficulties. The night before his inauguration, on April 30th, New York City overflowed with people vowing they would sleep in tents if necessary to get a look at their champion. Thousands cheered and women tossed flower petals, cannons boomed, there were glorious parades and emotional speeches. Washington was determined not to become His Majesty the King of America, but simply President. He wore a plain brown suit, simple black shoes with silver buckles, plain white silk stockings, and a long sword with a silver handle, all made in America. Washington served 2 full terms, an honor that became the role model for all future American presidents. 5 new states joined the Union while he was in office. The constitutional amendments and the Bill of Rights were approved by the states, and Washington worked hard to keep his young nation out of another war between Great Britain and